Hello, it's Bob Wells here, and welcome back to another episode of the Undercurrent Stories podcast. Today's episode is about a skill most of us have lost, but one our ancestors relied on every day, the ability to listen to animals. Long before books, screens, or even written language, humans paid close attention to the sounds, movements, and behaviours of the animals around them. Knowing when birds fell silent, when livestock grew restless, or when predators called out could mean the difference between safety and danger, success and failure. My guest today is Amelia Thomas, journalist, author and naturalist, and author of the book, What Sheep Think About the Weather, How to Listen to What Animals Are Trying to Say. Amelia spent a year studying how animals communicate, and more importantly, how humans can learn to interpret what animals are signalling, not through sentimentality or guesswork, but through careful observation, pattern recognition and respect for how animals actually behave. In this conversation, we'll talk about the different ways animals speak, why modern life has dulled our ability to notice these signals, and how learning to listen again can sharpen your awareness, deepen your connection to the natural world, and make you a more attentive, grounded observer overall. So if you've ever wondered what animals are really saying and what listening to them might teach you about yourself, this episode is definitely for you. Hello and welcome to Undercurrent Stories, Amelia.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
Well, it's great to have you on. I have to say, I really enjoyed the book, which you kindly sent me prior to the interview. Really good read. I read it over Christmas. It was a gentle book to read, lots of humour, and I learned so much.
Oh, that's great to hear. Thank you.
Before we talk about your life as a journalist and author, please can you just tell us a little bit about your life growing up and how you became interested in animals and how they communicate?
Yeah, well, my background for generations were farmers. So all my ancestors were farmers, and then my parents were sort of the first generation that decided not to go down that path. So I grew up in a sort of suburban setting, and I always felt a little bit like, I was missing out. You know, I would go on country walks past the fields and think, that's where I should be. I should be out in the fields somewhere. But so I made the most of it and tormented my parents by bringing home lots and lots of stray animals throughout my childhood. So pigeons that I found and rescuing mice that were supposed to be snake food. And, we ended up with lots of cats and rabbits and guinea pigs and all the animals that I was allowed into the house. I would sort of bring in. And I was just, there were also, despite it being suburbia, there were tons of animals around in the natural world. So my mum told me a story really recently of how when I was very little, she watched me walking up our garden very, very slowly to a fox that was asleep under an apple tree. And eventually, I guess I was just, I don't know how old I was, maybe 3 or 4, and ended up sitting next to the fox under the tree. So I suppose I've always been interested in these kind of commonalities that we have with animals. And I sort of spent my childhood finding every opportunity to spend time around them.
And what sparked your interest in writing a book, how animals communicate and listening to them?
It's been a question that's come back to me again and again over the years. We've ended up, even in adult life, I've ended up with waifs and strays and all these animals that other people had kind of considered to have behavioural problems, which I had to sort of untangle and figure out. And what I figured out was that a lot of behavioural problems, what we would consider to be those, are actually just miscommunications. The animals are in question is saying something to us, in inverted commas, saying, not with words, of course. And we're maybe misinterpreting or missing things that they're saying altogether. And that can be the sort of the path to understanding this sort of previously misunderstood animal.
It was interesting how you put the book together, both in terms of sort of going through the months of the year where you spent that year, studying the animals, as I mentioned at the beginning, but also in the three parts where you went through the sort of scientific part of it, the doing part of it, and then the more spiritual side of it. What made you construct it in that way?
When I set out to answer this question, which was just a very clear and sort of central question that I had, which is, what are animals trying to say to us? Not to each other so much, because there's loads of information, fantastic books, lots and lots of scientists working on that question. I was a little bit overwhelmed by the amount of people that are working in that field, the amounts of approaches that are taken. So I thought, all right, well, I'm going to take a full year. We just moved to a new farm, had a crazy day where I was reminded very clearly of how little I knew about what animals were still trying to say, because the horses were sort of going crazy. We had piglets that kept escaping. The dogs were fighting. It was all complete chaos. So I thought, right, there's an overwhelming amount of information. I've got to sort of try and structure it somehow. So I thought I'll start with what I almost find most intimidating, which is the science of listening to animals. I'm not a natural scientist. At school we were sort of confined to learning the periodic table and playing with a Van de Graaff generator, and that was pretty much it. So I had this sort of natural, a little bit fear of science. I thought, well, I'm not going to understand it. Maybe I'm not sort of clever enough to understand science. I'll start with that. So I delved into that first. Then from there, the second part of the book is about is something I'm a little bit more familiar with, which is the training sphere. So I went to trainers and people training people to listen better to animals. And because I'm sort of an amateur horse trainer, I felt a little bit more comfortable. That was a little bit more sort of solid ground for me. Although I still learned so many things. The third part of the book is about the intuitives. So that would be the trackers, the indigenous trackers, people who are working in the sphere of animal communication, which is the people who believe they've got some sort of unseen method of understanding what animals are going to say. And that was something I was really unfamiliar with and felt a little bit like that was an adventure into the unknown. And that the book sort of flowed in that way naturally too, that once I started off in science, it sort of led me on this sort of wave into things I was sort of almost less and less familiar with, and opened up more questions to answer. I had a lot of but hows, to ask experts. So, but how do you do that? And how and that sort of got me to the heart of the subject.
Yeah, I think it certainly worked out very well in that way, and I think the months of the year was a good way of putting each chapter or putting parts of it. The chapter aspect of it, I found that you were progressing quite a lot in every chapter, in every month, and there was what I liked about the book was that you got the distinction between what you're learning as you're traveling, but also the seasons and how much you learn, and the seasons themselves and the changes in temperatures and precipitation and all that.
Yeah, I kept bringing it back to the farm. So whenever we have a little farm here, and
sorry to interrupt,
I
should just point out you're in Eastern Canada, aren't you?
Well, that's right. Yes, I'm in Nova Scotia, in a small valley called the Annapolis Valley, which is a very old farming area. It's still very, very old-fashioned. You have these old Massey Ferguson tractors sort of chug by back and forth all summer. And it's quite bucolic, so it sort of lent itself to that being the centre of the book. And so, yeah, every time I learned something new, I would come back and try and apply it to one of our animals on the farm. So getting better acquainted with our piglets. There are two Cooney piglets that we got as pets. And the horses. I had both of the horses that I had at that time both had sort of what definitely many people would call behavioural problems. So that was an interesting challenge, and I think learning to listen better also helped me listen better, in a general sense, to the environment of the farm itself and to the wildlife that we have on the periphery. So there are pheasants, but there are also deer, porcupines. There's sometimes a bear comes through, raccoons, skunks, all kinds of animals that sort of made an appearance, hummingbirds that migrate back and forth every year. So I noticed that as well as listening to the animals that are our domestic animals, it became a sort of a challenge and a quest to listen better to the natural world around me.
Yes, I found one memory of the book I have is the bit where you started going out in the mornings, I think it was, just listening, just sitting, having a cup of coffee and listening.
that was something that started with a soundscape ecologist that I chatted with called Bernie Krause, and he is very, very cool. He's in his 70s, I think, or possibly early 80s by now, and he spent his life recording entire ecosystems and environments. So he would go out with recording equipment and record the sounds of nature as a whole. And what he did that was unusual at the time was, until then, like, libraries of natural sounds had isolated one sound. So they'd isolate like a bird call or, a squirrel, and they'd record that. And he said he was more interested in, he kind of had the analogy that was like listening to one instrument in a symphony.
Yeah.
You can't just isolate like the flute or the violin. And he discovered through that you could hear sounds of extinction possibly often better than you could see them. And so what he advocates for is that to kind of train your ear to understanding more about the environment by listening, you should go out once in the morning and just sit with your coffee, like you said. And then once early afternoon, when human noise seems to be a little bit, there's also a dip after lunch when traffic tends to be less, and then in the evening. And that way you'll get this understanding of your environment that you might not get if you just look around. And he said, and something that was reiterated by lots of trackers I talked to is that isn't only if you live on, in the countryside. You can do that on a balcony, you can do it in your back garden, in your allotment, you can go and do it in the park, if there's a park next to you. I even spoke to somebody, a musicologist, who said that you can learn the sounds of an individual bird who lives, on a street corner. And through that, you can learn to kind of relate to even a very urban environment really differently through this method of listening.
It's almost like a meditation, isn't it?
Yes, very much so. I think one interesting link to meditation is that they say that when you're meditating, you are not supposed to sort of keep grasping at the other. I must meditate. You let your mind, when your mind wanders, you sort of notice that it's wandered and you sort of gently just bring it back. And that's the same with listening, that you can go outside but you can't sort of go with this attitude of, right, what am I going to hear now? You've got to kind of let it go a little bit and be okay with whatever happens. And that practice is really good for us as humans because we are so used to being results focused, I think. Letting that go and just seeing, or in this case was listening, but it's interesting what kind of comes about as we get stiller in our lives.
I know exactly where you're coming from. I mean, I don't do it as a practice, and I'm sure many people like myself sometimes have just sat out in the garden when it's a beautiful day. You probably did it when it was bad weather as well, but when it was a beautiful day in the morning, you sit there, you have a cup of tea, and your mind wanders, and you hear all these distant things. You hear a plane going over at 39,000 feet. You hear the traffic in the distance. You hear some birds. You hear a few leaves. It's quite almost like a therapeutic type of experience.
Very much so, and just noticing that those sounds are there all the time, but when we're busy, we don't hear them. And the lovely thing is that you don't have, like you said, you don't have to be sort of going out with the intention of listening. A really great thing to do if you want to listen better to nature is actually go out with the intention of doing something else. So you could go out with a book. Because then again, you're not kind of going, come here, birds, I want to hear you. You're just reading your book and you become part of the scene. I think you slip into being part of the scene more easily. In my case, it happens a lot when I'm shoveling horse manure because, you're focused on doing that. And so nature accepts you as, okay, you're not a threat. You're not trying to be a predator, But it's a really good practice, even if you've only got 5 minutes. We're busy. We don't have necessarily the ability to go and sit outside for an hour every day or 3 times a day even. But any time that you take outside with just this kind of gentle intention of listening is really beneficial. Science has shown that's really good for our health. I
was amazed about the number of people that you spoke to. And I guess that sort of your journalistic career sort of helped sort of reaching out to people like that and getting interviews and that. And there was one particular one, and you might want to share some of the others with some of the scientists, particularly in the science part, this guy was talking about fruit flies have dialects.
Yes. So I spoke to an Oxford University neuroscientist who works with fruit flies, and he said that all the things that you think they sort of set challenges for these fruit flies, and he said they always surpass what they think fruit flies are able to do. Fruit flies, even if you clone them, don't behave identically. The reason I looked into this was because I was interested in seeing how listening is linked to personality. So I kind of had this idea that in order for an animal to have something to say, it needs to be an individual with a personality. So I talked to the fruit fly neuroscientist, and he said that fruit flies are actually bizarrely closer to us than we would expect. You know, they also get dopamine rushes, which we do when a pleasurable, situation occurs. And yes, they have the ability, if you put two sort of sets of fruit flies together from different environments, they will learn each other's dialects. And that's just unbelievable to me, because when we go to France and, can't understand what someone's saying and say it louder in English. And yet the fruit flies may be better at us than understanding each other's language.
It's quite amazing to sort of hear that an animal or an insect as small as a fruit fly has a structure inside it, a chemical structure inside that releases dopamine like we do.
Yes, and it's not just fruit flies. I spoke with a cockroach researcher too, who said the same thing, that they have sort of rudimentary emotions. So, they feel fear like we do. They feel joy or pleasure, and it's interesting that when we all know our cats and dogs have emotions and feel things similar to us. But when you start looking smaller and smaller, the similarities are still there. And that is fascinating to me.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I know what you mean about anybody who's listening who's got a cat or a dog will know. I mean, we all know. I mean, I'll give you my example. My cat, for example, he's got different meows for different things. So he'll meow playfully when he's on the stairs, and he'll turn round because he wants me to play with him on the stairs, put my hand through the banister and muck about. He loves that. He'll meow when he's hungry. He'll meow when he's tired. He doesn't really know what to do with himself, and so starts messing around. And I think everybody has a pet, and they know that's going to happen. And something that, I mean, probably move when we speak about the last part of the book, you mentioned about your son was experimenting with thought with a dog, one of your neighbour's dogs. But I've had it with, and probably other people have. I've had it with the cat where he's been out, and then I'll think about him where he's in. He'll come in. It's bizarre, isn't it? And some of the stories that you've recounted in the book with your own. I mean, it's very sad, but Major, your horse, was Major, wasn't it? Who sadly died. Right, you actually had pain. You were feeling physical pain, weren't you?
Yes, it was quite strange. So I think, one of the things about listening more closely is it's not selective. So once you start listening, you've got to listen to the not good stuff as well as the good stuff. That's part of listening as human. And listening comes in many ways. It's not just with your ears, of course. It can be, as you said, like just this sort of knowing that your cat, where is he? And then he would walk in. So I started getting these strange sort of physical pains that I'd never had before. Like, for example, I had a toothache, and I've never had a toothache in my life, and it was really painful. And then it sort of faded away. And that I found out that the vet was scheduled to come, and turned out that Major's teeth were bothering him. So, and then once he'd done the teeth, I never got that toothache again. And I was getting these aches and pains that I just couldn't understand where they were coming from. And it was, this is sort of into this woo territory that some people may have a problem, like, kind of relating to, except that the best way that somebody described that to me is, when somebody really well walks in, like your spouse or one of your kids or a friend walks into the room, and as soon as they walk into the room, before they've said a thing, if there's something wrong. You kind of have a feel about their mood. So somebody described it as akin to that. So you just pick up on these signals, and your human mind will sort of translate them in different ways. So I guess my human mind would not accept the thought that he might have a toothache. So I was like, right, body, I'll make your teeth hurt, and then you'll notice. So that was how a lot of these animal communicators kind of came to that topic. It's sort of this same knowing that sometimes you might have, you think of somebody and they phone you, or you know when someone's about to come. I mean, dogs do this a lot. You know when someone's about to come home, and then they show up on the drive. So that sort of thing was the best way of describing how those feelings kind of occur to you. But I think that we, as humans, just underplay our ability to have that kind of intuition all the time. We'll say no, that doesn't make sense. But I actually think we're much better at it than we think we are.
And that goes on to my next question, which is about the indigenous people, some of the indigenous peoples where, and I suppose we could link it to the trackers as well, where the trackers almost become the animal when they're tracking. Yes. Let's do that first then, and we'll do indigenous people later. But could you just share a bit about the trackers, Phyllis?
Yes, I had a question. One of the questions that I wanted to sort of get to the bottom of was that there are lots of accounts of indigenous cultures where a tracker or a shaman around a fire becomes an animal. And I really just wanted to know, what does that mean? Is it an allegory? Is it metaphor? What exactly does that mean? And somebody explained to me that he went on a persistence hunt, which is when hunters will pursue an animal all day until the animal is so tired that absolutely cannot get away anymore, and that's how they catch it. And this would go on for hours and hours and hours and hours. So he said that he was accompanying an indigenous master tracker on that trail. He said he thinks it's to do with the rhythmic footfall, the concentration on the environment, on every small detail, on this kind of rhythmic breathing that happens, on exhaustion that happens over the hours of doing it, that he started to get like flashes of being almost in the animal's skin. And seeing the world from the point of view of the animal that they were tracking, and then that sort of translates into the way that those same rituals then are held around a fire. So around a campfire, let's say, there would be a shamanic ritual. There would be rhythmic drum beat, be dancing for hours, and that kind of coincides with these accounts of shamans sort of becoming like embodying the animal. And sort of understanding it from the inside out almost. That was really interesting, because I then talked to a professor who's at the University Department studies. It's sort of interspecies communication in ways that we don't that Western science does not necessarily understand, and she sort of said to me, we can't discount other ways of knowing apart from our sort of empirical, scientific, Western paradigm. And that goes back to intuition, right? Is that we maybe do know more about what others are saying without words than we think we do.
It's interesting, isn't it? I must admit, when I first heard about what you were doing and the book, I thought when I was going to read the book, I was going to hear a lot, and you touched on some of it, I was going to hear a lot about getting animals to actually talk, like a parrot and the chimpanzee and signs and things like that. And you do mention that. And there was one particular lady, I can't remember what her name was and whereabouts it was in the book, but she was actually regretting what she did with chimpanzees.
Yes. Yeah, so that her name is Mary Lee Jensvold, and she's a primate researcher. And during the 1960s and 70s, there was sort of a bit of a move to, which we've kind of moved away from now. But at that time, researchers were really interested in figuring out how much animals could say using a human language, could be taught to use, not just parrot back, but actually, incorporate into their communication systems. So there were lots of people working with primates. There was also somebody, Irene Pepperberg, worked for years with Alex, the African grey parrot, doing the same. So they were teaching these non-humans a human language. And in the case of primates, it was often American Sign Language. So I went off to meet the last remaining chimps that were involved in those trials. And they were taught, they were captive chimps. They led lives that were necessarily sort of curtailed compared to wild chimps, and spent a lot of time with humans. And they learned a great deal of American Sign Language, and not just learnt it sort of as in could show it back to you, but could use it in conversation with each other, with the researchers. Sometimes the chimps would be looking through a book or a magazine and would be signing as if they're like thinking out loud. So they were really, incorporating like a tremendous amount of a human language into their communication, which is, that's incredible. Like, I find it really hard to learn another human language. Like, my French is terrible. So I saw this chimp named Lulis who's signing to us in a human language, like another species speaking a human language. It's just unbelievable. But what it did was that the researchers started to realize that as they kind of recognized the depths of understanding and emotional complexity and mental complexity of these animals that they were working with, and they were working in kind and considerate ways. These animals had what would be considered by scientists to be a great life. How these animals should not be being kept in captivity at all, because their lives, their social lives, their emotional lives are so complex that she said that she would go on holiday with her kids, come back, and the chimps were still there, having not been able to experience those things. There were a couple of incidents where a chimp would ask for a key because the chimps know that the humans have got the keys, but they also sort of know they're not going to be let out. So what she said was that it was really valuable to do those studies. They've got lots of information. Now they know that, but now they know that they shouldn't do that again. So those experiments don't happen anymore. The chimps do still sign, but they're in sort of an old chimps home in retirement. And she is very clear on the fact that scientists should not go down that road
and
again.
Did you get the impression that the chimps were genuinely communicating, or was it a sort of Pavlov's dog type thing where they were just conditioned to put up a sign? What were your thoughts there?
I think they're genuinely communicating. Chimp languages in the wild are very gestural, like they're very complex and gestural. I spoke to Professor Kat Hobater at the University of St Andrews, and she studies chimp gesturing in the wild as a form of communication, like a language. So they're already sort of primed for that form of communication. I think something that sort of differentiates between the idea that they would sort of be parroting or Pavlov's dog conditioning and actual use of language is the fact that the chimps would make up words for things, combine gestures to make up new words for things that they didn't have a word.
Yeah, I know.
So I think they had Thanksgiving turkey one year, and they didn't know the word for turkey, so one of the chimps signed bird meat. So she put those two things together. And that sort of, to me, is a sign of meaningful communication. I also think it's to do with the fact that those chimps, so some of the chimp language trials, like the Professor Herb Terrace did language trials with a chimp, kind of a famous chimp called Nim Chimpsky, which was sort of a play on words of Noam Chomsky, the linguist. And those, he said, failed. I think the reason that his failed compared to the ones that worked is because the ones that worked, they taught the chimps as you would teach, as a child learns like a human child. So they'd learn the word for ball, but they wouldn't get a treat, which is kind of a classic way of learning teaching an animal a trick. They would then receive the ball. So then, it makes a very clear parallel between the gesture that they've just learned and the object itself. So it's not like I sign ball, I get a cookie. It's like I sign ball and now I have access to that ball. And that's sort of much closer to how it's sort of a natural way of learning language.
So I suppose the next question would be if that, and it's unlikely to be done again, that we, in society in the way that it was done then, but if that can be achieved with chimps, what other animals could it be achieved with?
Well, yeah, I think chimps are sort of because of their ability to use gestures, that's American Sign Language or any kind of sign language sort of lends itself to that kind of communication. But, for example, people are experimenting all over the place with those button boards. I experimented with the button boards. They are a really good form of...
the button board is with American Sign Language.
So no, the button boards are these little buttons that you record your voice. So let's say you've got a dog and they like to be patted. So you would record a button, like a physical button, like an old game show button with your voice saying like pat, and then you put it on the floor. And then you teach the dog that if they want to be patted, they'll press the button. It says pat. Yeah. And then you give them a pat. And so that's something that people are experimenting with even with guinea pigs and pets.
Wow.
Yeah. I'm a little bit, I wouldn't say I'm skeptical about it, but I don't think that there's much that I think that does lend itself perhaps to parroting a little bit more. And something that, there's some very famous dogs that do that. And you can see those clips online of Bunny the sheepadoodle, who kind of says in inverted commas, all these things with complex strings of button sentences. But a dog specialist called Dr. Alexandra Horowitz told me that she thinks that if we sort of reduce a dog communication to them pressing a button with a human word attached to it, that we then risk missing out on the subtleties of us watching them and understanding their signals better. So my feeling is it's interesting, but I don't think it's the best way to be listening to animals.
And where do you think all this is going to go? I mean, obviously you spent, the book came out last year. So was it 23, 24 that you did your year of research?
Yes, it ended in 2024, and then the book came out in November 2025.
Yeah. And where do you think it's going to lead to?
I think I think there's great things happening in all these spheres, which is that we have turned away from that old model of trying to teach animals human languages, and now we're much more interested in learning the depths and the subtleties of their natural ways of communication. So I think science, that's definitely the way that it's gone. I'm a little bit guarded about the AI component of which is very trendy right now in science. That there's, if you see a headline, and you'll see them quite frequently saying something like, we are 3 months away from decoding whale speak or something like that. And I don't think that that's necessarily accurate. I think AI is great at aggregating huge data sets. It's really good at extrapolating patterns from those. But ascribing a definite meaning to that pattern is harder when our lives are so different from, let's say, a whale. How do we know? Okay, we know that this is the thing, this is the string of communication that happens at this time when they're doing this, but that's not the same as having a dictionary, So I think it's really heartening that people are becoming more and more interested. Science is using AI to try to figure out sounds of unhappiness in animals that are factory farmed. I mean, even if that's a limited use, it's still, beneficial to those animals, those individuals. So things are going in a good way, I think. And we love our pets. We are very interested in knowing more about them. So I think the fact that there's an interest in kind of a willingness to try to understand more of what animals are saying is a good sign for our future. And, obviously for the future of conservation and the environment too.
And what about yourself, Amelia? How has the experience? I mean, obviously you had a year of quite intense research. Has that research, well, two questions really. Have you continued doing research, or have you sort of built on what you've already learned, and how has it changed you? and your relationship with animals?
Yes, I'm so again, I think it's one of those things, like I said earlier, that it can be a sort of a bit of a double-edged sword to listen really carefully because, I spend an awful lot of time in the summer now putting flies outside because, once you understand the similarities between us and them, you can't do anything else. You kind of start being very kind of considerate of every tiny little creature around you, which can take quite a lot of time. Yes, I'm still learning. Like I'm really interested in all the. I'm still chatting with trainers and scientists, things like that, and learning new stuff. How it's changed me, I think I'm much more patient with listening to my animals than I used to be, and I've learned to trust that intuition a little bit more and combine it with, you can sort of layer those things upon each other. So you can kind of layer what you know about science with training techniques that you've learned, and then sort of place on top of that this kind of openness to feeling things too, to listen better. So it's helped in my relationships with my horses, definitely with my dogs. I feel like I understand the piglets better. We're headed into a new year of having some new animals on the farm, so I'll be doing that with some calves quite soon too. And I think I would definitely recommend that. It's a great practice to be in because I also think it helps you listen to humans.
I was going to ask you that question too. So, and what would you say in terms of the animals? Do you think that the animals on your farm and the wild animals around you, have they noticed any difference, do you think?
Absolutely, yes. A lot of people who have problems with a horse will say, the horse doesn't like me. Right, but often it's just the way that we are sort of speaking in inverted commas to them is just not something that they like. Some horses, we tend to be really physical creatures. We like to put our hands first. We like to pet things, and an animal may not like that. So once you understand that about them and you see their small signals, then you can sort of have a gentler and kind of calmer relationship with them. So we have less explosive drama than we used to have.
It just reminded me, there's one little thing in the book about cats where, and I think most animals look you in the eye, don't they? Correct me if I'm wrong, but I know that my cat does. And this bit about when you look at them, just roll your eyes down a bit, do a long, slow blink. That's supposed to build a relationship, I understand.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, it's a very easy thing you can do and it works with cats on the street too. So if there's a little cat somewhere and you wanted her to come over and say hi, then just slow blink, because it's saying to the cat. I mean, on a basic level, if the cat closes its eyes, the cat is saying, "I trust you because you're not going to attack me while my eyes are closed." So if you do it, you're saying, "I trust you," and that will sort of encourage that cat to come over perhaps and say hi.
And how, you obviously spoke to a lot of scientists, and some of them, I mean, I was amazed how many youthful 70 and 80-year-olds there were that you spoke to. It's quite amazing. I'm sure there's younger ones coming through, but how do you think the science part of it is, what's the dynamic now between the science part of it and what we described earlier as the sort of woo-woo part of the telepathic element of it?
So I think it used to be that science, the idea of anthropomorphism in any form was pretty much a death knell for a scientist, and that has changed. Scientists, I think, are more open to feeling things than they used to. But also, I spoke to a couple of scientists who told me, science has always relied on the moments of breakthrough in science have often been because of a feeling. So, a scientist will be like, I have this feeling that might work. And it's not because necessarily of their research or their data, they just have a feeling that will work. And then they pursue that. And that's when a breakthrough occurs. So she told me that she thinks there's always been this place of intuition in science. And another scientist told me that, it used to be that any kind of anomalies, so all the sort of subtleties, let's say, of animal communication, would be written out of science in the service of sort of having neat data sets. So that's changed, and scientists in the field are really interested in the the individuality of these animals and the circumstances that they're in. So looking at learning about their communication styles in much more subtle ways that are not just X plus Y equals the answer. So I think as science has moved along, younger generations of scientists are more interested in just leaning into that feeling and in the kind of connections between those two sort of spheres.
And one last question I've got, Amelia, is if we've got any listeners who would like to find out more in terms of how they can understand communication with animals, they might well have a pet, a dog, cat or a horse or something, or they might not do. What advice would you give them?
So I think the most important thing we can do is slow down. We humans move really quickly. So we're trying to understand what an animal's, got to say. And we'll sort of make a snap judgment, right? We'll just say, okay, that, whereas if you slow down, try and see things a little bit from their perspective. Like even just physically, I got down on somebody that I took to recommended that I get down onto the animal's level and sort of experience life from their perspective physically, So try and put yourself in their paws a little bit, and as much as you can, ask why they're doing something or why it might be, and just be curious. And I think the other thing is just the key sort of to listening better, I think, is just noticing little tiny things that we might otherwise discount. Like, for example, with dog, it might be the way that they're looking. So they might be trying to tell you something just by the way where they're looking. The same with cats. And that's something if we're in a hurry in our human world, we might just miss out on. So sort of slowing down in order to notice the smaller things is probably the most sort of transformative thing you can do in relationships with animals when you're on a walk in the countryside, or your animals at home, or the birds at the bird table, whatever it might be.
Well, this has been a really fascinating and interesting conversation, Amelia. So fascinating to hear about a subject that we don't hear about very often, and yet appears to be within our power, deep in our psyche. Perhaps something that we've temporarily forgotten about as our species has evolved, and yet could well be in for a renaissance. My guest today has been Amelia Thomas. Amelia is an author, journalist and naturalist, and author of the book, What Sheep Think About the Weather, How to Listen to What Animals Are Trying to Say, and I can thoroughly recommend it. And you can find links to the book and Amelia's website in the show notes. Thank you for going on the show, Amelia.
Thank you so much for having me.